Good evening. And welcome. I'm Alan Sabinson. I'm Dean of the Westfall College of the Arts and Design, which houses the photography program and of which Stuart Rome is part of. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. I think you're in for an enormous treat seeing Stuart speak to his work, but for us it's also a bittersweet occasion, which I will speak to. I also feel like my comments, many of you will all know, this is sort of like an AA meeting, except it's the Friends of Stu. So Stuart Rome, and I should say full Professor Stuart Rome, has been a mainstay of the Drexel Photography program since its inception in 1985. He was the co-creator of the program, and he has taught generations of students who have gone on to successful careers in photography, many of whom are with us here today. Stuart has exhibited extensively over the years in solo and group exhibitions. His most recent project, Oculus, was awarded the Simon Guggenheim Foundation Award in 2015. His publications include Maya, Treasures of an Ancient Civilization, Forest, a monograph, Signs and Wonders, and his work is included in the public collections, and this is just a snippet, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the International Museum of Photography at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York. The New York Times wrote in one apt review of Stuart's work, "As a landscaper photographers do, Stuart Rome travels a lot. The unassumingly beautiful pictures in the show were shot in Florida, Nova Scotia, and Bali, among other places. Excepting some scenes of sea caves in Thailand, and they're beautiful pictures, Mr. Rome tends to steer away from conventionally picturesque scenes. He likes to shoot off the path and into the sort of dense, messy, ordinary growth that the trail is designed to quickly bypass." Well, I believe Stuart is excited about having more time now to devote to his art. We're sorry to see Stuart retire after his nearly 35 years at Drexel. We're losing a demanding but talented teacher who pushed students to achieve more. Stuart adheres to the artist's way, and he's always been the artistic conscience of the photography program, ensuring that our program educated students on the highest level of artistic achievement, both from the masters and in their own work. And we're losing a friend. Not long after my appointment in 2005, he and Catherine invited me into their home, where I've returned several times since. Together, they're incredibly gracious hosts with numerous artists and artistic friends, and they bring them together in their own version of an artistic salon. Stuart, on behalf of the university, this college, your students, your alumni, and your colleagues, we want to thank you for your friendship, your mentorship, your teaching, your art, and your long service. May the coming years be wonderful and successful for you, and please don't be a stranger. Stuart.
Wow. Thank you all for coming tonight. If I screw this up, do I still get my severance package? Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how my photographic career was a dream come true and a passport into a lot of worlds where I probably didn't belong. But my beginnings started unremarkably in a suburban neighborhood in 1950s Connecticut. It was an unhappy childhood for me. I hated suburbia. The idea and the models of participation were live for tomorrow. While we were going to school and ducking under cover for the next atomic bomb, my parents were always warning us you could only trust our own tribe of Jews because the next Holocaust was around the corner. And so living for tomorrow didn't make any sense at all. Plus, When I was a teenager, I was told you couldn't have sex till you got married. That was a problem. And so I couldn't wait to leave suburban Connecticut. Luckily, the 1960s arrived. It's where the time I came of age. And it was all about escape, that period of time. One was because the Vietnam War was happening and many of my friends got low numbers in the draft, and so they went off to far distant places like Alaska and northern Canada as a way of escaping. And to me, I was jealous. Even though my number was high and I wasn't going to go into the draft, I wanted to have an adventure. I was in school all my life. My daughter will appreciate this. So I didn't want to go to college. I wanted just to leave Connecticut, but I didn't know how to do that. My best friend had a low number in the draft and he went off to Alaska. I dreamed of going and being his partner. He was a trapper in Alaska. Can you believe that? And so in high school, I used to escape to, where is the changer? I guess it's here. Does that work? Yeah. I would escape. My brother, this is one of the earliest photographs I could find. My brother John was a draft dodger, and he was escaping from the draft, eluding the military. This is before the internet, so you could be stopped by policemen. You would just say your name was something else, and nobody bothered you. And he lived at an ethnomusicology commune at Wesleyan University. So that's where I would go. It was an amazing place. Norman O'Brien was teaching at Wesleyan at the time, John Cage was there, but more importantly to me, there was the head of the ethnomusicology department, a guy named David McAllister, who was my first true mentor. At that school at the time, there were kuma drum players, sitar players, Ravi Shankar's first concert was there, Balinese gamelan, musicians from all over the world. It was extraordinary, and they all came to the farm to play because there were no proscriptions there. You could do anything. And David was a mentor for me for a number of years, was when I was trying to figure out what I was going to be, because I really wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to be an artist of some kind. I didn't know what kind that was going to be. I knew I liked photography because my buddy who went to Alaska, he and I would go on trips together photographing, and I thought photography would be the thing for me. But when it came time to go to college and all my friends were leaving to escape from the draft, I didn't know what to do. So I applied to school for creative writing, Middlebury College, very late, and RIT for photography, very late. And I was really lucky because RIT took me, even though it was a really difficult school to get into. I went for the first year, and I met amazing people, including Allison Rossiter, who's here tonight. He was the first person I met while I was there. And I made friendships that have lasted to this day. But I was bored there, and I wanted to have adventure. And so I decided I was going to join my friend in Alaska. But after one winter in Rochester, I realized I hated cold weather. But by that time, I had already decided to leave. I'd bought my guns and my dog, and I was going to go to Alaska, and I decided I couldn't. So I bummed around for 2 years trying to figure out how to learn photography on my own. And I was very unsuccessful. But I remembered sitting in classes that were taught by John Fall and Betty Hahn. They were really important teachers at the time. And I decided I was going to go back and study with John Fall. Luckily, John was just embarking on his most important early work, which was called Altered Landscapes. Back then, it's hard to believe now, but back then, you could count the number of art photographers in the under 200. And to break new territory, all you had to do was put color film in your camera. I mean, it was really not that difficult to carve out territory that was idiosyncratically your own. It's a very different story now, of course, as you all know. But John was a very important early 70s color photographer. And not only was I his student, but I was working as a janitor. My parents wouldn't pay for me to go back to school. They thought I had blown my opportunity. And so I had to pay my way. And I worked as a janitor at the school, incredibly depressing work. And John insisted at that moment that he would hire me instead to work at him for slightly more money. And I would live with him and his wife, Bonnie Gordon, another remarkable artist, in Buffalo during the summer. And during the winters, I would be his assistant printer. So I got an incredible education from John. And this is one of his early photographs, the Bermuda Triangle. So by the time I was a junior in undergraduate college, I decided, I knew the language of photography. What was I going to do with it? How was I going to talk about something that was really relative to my own experience? Because I didn't even know who I was at the time. And I took a writing class at RIT, and the teacher pulled out that chestnut, write what you know. So I thought, I'm going to photograph the things that depressed me from growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut. And I was living in the farm country of West Henrietta outside of Rochester that was quickly being overrun by suburban tract homes, which was going to change. And I thought, well, this is my world. This is what I'm going to photograph. And I did it, large format color. And I called this project Modern Mythologies, in a way because what I was hoping for was that the pictures would have in them elements that were lyrical or maybe slightly poetic. Because for me, photography is the closest visual art form to poetry, in which, unlike visual elements, can be combined to form a trapdoor between the areas that don't quite match. And I was looking for something like that. It was my idea. I also had all these different interests: poetry, archaeology, anthropology, literature. I didn't know how to combine all these things into one thing. So this was my first attempt. And for some reason, I was successful. The George Eastman House bought some of the work. They made my first solo show there at the International Museum of Photography. I think it was 1978, 1 year after graduating as an undergraduate. And I was so full of myself. I would go and show this work to John Zarkowski. I walked into Castelli Gallery and Sonnabend, and Sonnabend decided to represent me. Not only that, but Ileana Sonnabend saw herself as potential mentor for me. So once again, I had somebody else who was showing me some kindness. And it was weird because Ileana was a force to be reckoned with. Most people were very afraid of her, but she was like a Jewish grandmother to me. Around the same time, I was also offered an artist in residence, light work in Syracuse University. And when I went there was an artist in residence as well for a short time named Fielding Dawson. And Fielding and I became very good friends. He was a chronicler of Black Mountain, good friends with Franz Klein, de Kooning, you name it. He was part of that crew, which for me were a mythic group of people. And he couldn't have been kinder. He was a collage artist, a writer. He taught at Sing Sing because he believed in second chances for people. A lot of those people that he taught got out from death row and became famous poets. He was a remarkable guy. And so after that experience, I also had itchy feet still to travel. I had a little money from selling photographs, and I went to New Orleans for the first time, where my brother John, who had been a draft dodger, had gotten out of military prison finally, and was working, and actually was running one of the best jazz clubs in New Orleans. And so I would go and visit him. I didn't have the stamina for New Orleans in the 1970s, but I made a couple of decent photographs. So I went back to New York and worked for Ileana. Here she is. And I photographed her, part of her collection. The first thing she asked me to photograph, though, at RIT, I was a terrible student in some ways. I loved working with John and Betty, but studio lighting I could have done without. I wished I had thought more about that, because the first thing she gave me to photograph was the Robert Rauschenberg bathroom, which has a mirror on it. And I must have photographed that thing a half a dozen times before I got something that was reproducible. But I got my true graduate education was working at Sonnabend, where I photographed pictures like these, Jasper Johns and Cy Twombly and Andy Warhol. And at that point, though, I was living in a little cabin that had been abandoned for 50 years, had no electricity or running water. I lived in that cabin for about a year. I had very little money, and I got offered a free scholarship to graduate school in Arizona. Ileana was horrified that I was going to leave New York and ruin my career to be a student again. But oddly enough, the idea of not having to work for 3 years, I was offered a 3-year scholarship. I actually did my graduate education in 2 because all I did was photograph. I left, I went to Arizona State University, and I got to travel, which was always my desire. I traveled through Sonora, Mexico. I traveled through the Southwest, and I began experimenting with ideas about cut-up imagery, collage, influenced by people like Fielding. And these are a few attempts from this series that was called Stained Glass. This work was shown at the Janet Borden Gallery early on. And it included things that I was reading, like Dante's Divine Comedy, of Storm and Counterstorm, The Day My Guardian Angel, blah, blah, blah. You know, it was like trying to be William Blake, but not having the chops yet. And I moved from Tempe, Arizona to Tucson with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife. And she had had enough of me after a couple of years. She was much younger than I, and she gave me my walk-in papers. So as I was leaving with a U-Haul trailer from Tucson, I saw her standing bereft in the middle of the road at glow time. I got out of the U-Haul and made that photograph. That's my shadow on her chest. You know, I also apologize to my friends who have heard so many of these stories before. I apologize. But who does this kind of thing? I mean, a photographer, I suppose. But it's a weird thing to do because diary was relevant to me. It was a way I began to understand my own life, was through seeing pictures from my world. And it continues to be to this day. So after I left Tucson, I had some money, I had a car, I drove through the Southwest until my money ran out and my car broke down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Luckily, Betty Hahn was teaching there and took me in as a friend, gave me a spare bedroom. And she introduced me to the director of the Albuquerque Museum, where I thought I could sell a few prints, get my car fixed, and continue on my way. So I walked into the Albuquerque Museum with my portfolio in hand. I told the director my story, Jim Menyert, my story, and after 5 minutes he said, "Stay here." He walked out. He came back in with 3 or 4 people. And the questions they started asking me were odd. They had nothing to do with our conversation. Do you like to travel? Yeah. Can you make studio photographs? I couldn't really, but I did a little bit. And I said, yeah. And on his desk was a bubblegum machine from the 1950s, he used as a paperweight. He said, it was a Friday, take this home, make a 4x5 transparency, bring it back on Monday. So I bought it home. I went to a used bookstore, got a book on studio lighting, bought 3 color temperature light bulbs and 2 reflectors, and a couple of used lighting stands, set them up, and failed 3 or 4 times, went back and forth to the color lab till I got a perfect transparency, and went back to the Albuquerque Museum like nothing, like was no big deal. So I got this job, and it was for this book, Maya Treasures of an Ancient Civilization. It was amazing to travel through Latin America, photographing things as they came out of the ground often. And so we traveled, the first day we left Albuquerque, we left with 37 cases of photographic material, including seamless backdrop paper, 4x5 transparency film, all this stuff, right? And gas generators to run our lights. We would run, when we were in country, we would run little canoes downriver to sites with all this material in it. It was crazy. But it was the adventure I'd always hoped for. And so, you know, I photographed some of the great treasures of the Mayan world, and I did this alongside a fantastic archaeologist and anthropologist. 3 years before this, I went to see David McAllister at Wesleyan and told him I wasn't sure if I could make a living as a photographer. You know, back then, if you sold a photograph, right, Paul, was like $150 if you were lucky. If you're lucky. And you couldn't live on that, you know, you just couldn't. So most of us waited on tables or were bartenders. I was not good with people very well, as my students will attest. So he told me, I said, you know, I'm thinking about going back to school for a graduate and postgraduate degree in archaeology. I'm thinking about coming to Wesleyan. What do you think? And he said, terrible idea. First of all, archaeologists are generally wealthy people, and if they're not, they're incredibly lucky to get jobs. And you have this skill that archaeologists would pay you to work for them and tell you things they would never tell their students because we're very jealous about our research. So there, 3 years later, I'm working with Clemency Coggins, the great Mionist from Harvard and the Peabody Museum. I'm working with Flora Clancy, the iconographer who at that time was breaking the code to what these actually said, what the iconography was. And they were friendly to me, they were nice to me. And we would sit around after 10-hour days of photographing, handling these spectacular objects, talking about what they might mean. So, you know, these are some of the pictures from that book. This was sitting in somebody's living room. Joanne Andrews in the Yucatan had this on a dining room table. And this came out of the ground like maybe a day before I arrived from Mundo Perdido, and it looked like it had just come out of Woolworths. I mean, it was brand spanking new. I loved the idea of what things might be, symbols of what things might be. And of course, archaeologists and anthropologists are much more conservative. They have to be because they publish, and I don't, I just talk. And so I would look at a piece like this and say to Clemency, well, this is a jaguar, but there's a phallus as a nose and a clitoris as a mouth. What is that about? And she'd look at it and say, I think you're nuts. And then after a couple of beers, she'd say, well, you know, I never thought about it that way. When the book was published and the show came out, it was about a year after we had finished, and I had a lot of money in my pocket. But it burned a hole through my pocket, and I traveled around the United States photographing and ran out of money in the middle of winter in Boston. What a bad idea, after spending 7 years in the Southwest. And I had friends at the Museum of Fine Arts School, and they gave me adjunct teaching to keep me in peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. But I thought, you know, when the book comes out, if it does fairly well, maybe I could get a job teaching because I have a graduate degree, which I wasn't planning on getting. And I have this book, which I hadn't planned on getting either. And the book won, I think, Best Museum Publication in the year it came out. And the show garnered amazing reviews. So I applied for a few teaching jobs. And there were a couple of people that were very interested. But I had lived in the hinterlands of the Southwest for 7 years. And one of the jobs that was offered was here in Philadelphia. I thought close to New York, but not as intimidating. I have the ADD thing. New York was never a good place for me to live. And I thought, why not? Well, this would be terrific for me. And the challenge of helping a college start a photo program, I thought, was, why not? I could do that. Well, I didn't realize that, one, I'm not a patient guy, as my students will attest. And I didn't know if I had the patience to actually run a program, which I did not have. I could organize the spaces with the architects. I could work on that, how a darkroom should be, because I had the great experience of RIT. I could work on the sequence of courses, the analysis of photographic materials into a language, the synthesis, so every photography student could figure out how to speak like their own individual self. I could do that, but the day-to-day running of a photo program, I did not have the skill set for. So thank you, Paul. Thank you. Thank you very much. Because without Paul Runyon, I would not have been able to do a lot of the work that I've accomplished over the years. When I moved here in 1985, it was a weird time. I think my job interview was the week after the MOVE bombing. And I thought, when I was driving down, why am I going to take a job in Philadelphia? I mean, it was crazy. But I liked the people that I met here right away. Philadelphia is an amazing place, as you all know. So I moved here, I set into an apartment in Southwest Philadelphia. I got a 2-bedroom apartment. One of the bedrooms became a color darkroom. And within 2 months, I was already making pictures. This is the first photograph I made in Philadelphia, and it's a Halloween picture in my neighborhood at 49th near Baltimore. I began to think, I had this experience photographing in places where there was still tribal culture. Why couldn't I see my own culture in a way ceremonially? And ritual's always been very important to me. So to me, this had an element of that. And so I began looking for things in Philadelphia that had elements of rites and rituals, and rites of passage. And of course, for me, boxing was one. It was fighting against pain. This was an amazing fighter, Tony Two Guns. He was an incredible fighter. This was an amazing fight. I went with Spencer to see this fight. I would often go with Larry Fink too. And sometimes at the very end of the fight, I would jump into the ring to make a photograph. It was crazy. There were no rules back then. You know, and I also was interested in photographing things that were frightening to me. Because my parents had told me that you couldn't trust anybody outside of my tribe, one of the things I was curious to photograph was the big Ku Klux Klan rally in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is in an African-American neighborhood. Talk about chutzpah. And I lasted about 25 minutes there. And people kept on asking me, what church do you go to? First Baptist Church. The third person that came to me and said, you're a Jew, aren't you? And I said, busted. 3 guys came, picked me up, and threw me out in the parking lot. But before that, I made about 6 or 7 really good photographs. You know, but there are a lot more fun rituals to photograph than this. And one of them is the Mummers Parade. My first winter in Philadelphia on January 1st, I was feeling a little forlorn. I didn't realize at the time I had so many friends here already. Paul Kava, Jeannie Pierce, Alida Fish. I mean, so many good people from my RIT days were here, but I didn't know that yet. And so I was walking around Center City, and I encountered this blue-collar trans parade. You know, I was a big fan of William Burroughs, and I thought, wow, this is like his territory. And so every year on January 1st, I walk in the parade pretending I'm a news photographer. When people ask me what newspaper I photograph for, it's the Drexel Times. And so this fed into this idea of, you know, modern mythologies as well. But I still had itchy feet. You know, I had a job now. I had money coming in every month, which was unusual for me. And I thought about traveling again. One of my idols in Rochester was Linda Connor, who made it her career as a traveling photographer with an 8x10 view camera. She was an intrepid, she still is, an intrepid woman. I adored her work, and over the years we became very good friends. So I thought, why can't I do something like Linda? But the second summer I was here, I got paired with Chicago painter Tony Fitzpatrick to do an article called The Roots of the Blues. And we drove from Chicago down to Memphis, through Nashville, and we did these pictures. He did drawings, I did photographs. And he also had a show in Chicago called The Pagan Hour, which I was often on as this photographer, Sam Silverfish, who photographed accidents. And it was a wild radio show where I was this fictional character. And so one of the things we were supposed to do on this trip was get kicked out of Graceland. We tried our damnedest, but we never really did get kicked out of Graceland. A year after that, I was beginning to show working in New York again at a gallery that dealt in tribal art, run by Randall Morris, a wonderful guy. And he told me about his plans to photograph in Haiti and to photograph Andre Pierre. Now, Andre Pierre, I don't know if you know who Maya Deren was, but Andre Pierre was Maya Deren's teacher in the 1950s. She was an experimental filmmaker who worked alongside people like Joseph Cornell. She was a great dancer. She made incredible films like Meshes in the Afternoon. And this was her teacher, Andre Pierre. He was still alive. He was an amazing painter, and we spent a lot of time with him in Port-au-Prince. And he made it possible for us to photograph other voodoo priests in their home forts, in their voodoo temples, and also to photograph trance. This is the first time I ever got a chance to see this in person. Maya Deren had made a film called Tell My Horse. It was a book and a film which was about these kinds of ceremonies, which I'd seen when I was in college, but never expected to see in person. And at a certain point, I realized this is not my culture. I feel like an outsider. I shouldn't be doing this. It felt wrong. So I kept on putting my camera back in the car and picking it up again because it was so amazing. I couldn't stop photographing. And at one point, this young woman walked up to me, and all these people surrounded us in a circle chanting, T Blanc, the little white one. And she weighed about 85 pounds, and at one point her eyes rolled back, she picked me straight up in the air and threw me in that mud pit. And for a split second, I thought, if I throw my camera away, I can experience trance firsthand. So I went like this, but I couldn't let it go. I'm a photographer. I'm not a Haitian. So then we continued on photographing these. This is dancing in a home fort. A year later, I was giving a lecture about this work in Los Angeles at the Otis Parsons College. And an old friend of mine came up to me to tell me about a trip he had recently taken to Bali, where ritual is incredibly important. Not only that, but outsiders were very valuable. You brought lots of juice to a ceremony if you were from far away. And photographing was a sign of respect. Can you imagine? To me, this was like, oh, wow, this called to me. So I remembered one of my friends from the ethnomusicology commune, this guy on the left here, Stephen Alpert, who over the 15, 18 years had become a very important tribal art dealer. And there's a collection named after him at the Dallas Museum of Art. So I figured out where he lived. I contacted him. I sent him some slides of my work in Haiti, some work from the Maya job. And I said, you know, I want to go to Bali. Do you have any suggestions? And 5 days later, I got this breathless call saying, you got to come to Dallas. I said, yeah, I'm teaching. You got to come to Dallas this weekend. So I flew to Dallas, and I met Andrea Nasher, part of the Nasher family collection. The Nashers have the largest private collection of 20th century sculpture in the world. And there's now a museum that's dedicated to their collection in Dallas with their name. At the time, there was no home for it. So most of the sculpture lived in their backyard on Turtle Creek. But now it's safely all ensconced in their museum. The last collection that Patsy Nasher collected before she died was an Indonesian reliquary collection of objects going back to the Bronze Age. So Andrea had this idea to honor her mom. She wanted the objects photographed, and for objects that were like them to be shown how they were used in very remote areas in Indonesia. Would I be interested in working on such a project? And so that's what happened. First, I went to Dallas and photographed the objects like I had done for Maya. And a lot of the objects are related to the natural world, like a fiddle fern or the patterns found in the forest. That started to resonate with me. And so that summer, I went to Indonesia for the first time. And one of the first people I met, who I became very close to, was a guy who was like family for me. His name was Lauren Blair. And it was the year his book and his BBC series, Ring of Fire, had just come out. So he's being celebrated. He and his brother Lawrence had worked on this project for 10 years. They could never finish it. They had way more material than they could edit. They couldn't figure out how to edit it. So his buddy from school, Richard Branson, some of you might recognize that name, said, you know, let me take it over. And his buddy, George Harrison, said, I'll help produce it. And so 2 years later, the book and this movie come out, and they were extraordinary. And so Lauren, here's a picture of him photographing in Irian Jaya where people didn't wear clothes. I mean, he didn't wear clothes either. And this is Lauren in his house with his little Nuri. He was just a dear man. And whenever I would go on my trips into the archipelago, because Bali was our home base, he would always pull out maps, tell me about shipping schedules, how I would get from one place to another. He was an incredible, generous friend. And so I began traveling the archipelago. I photographed boxing matches in Flores. This is the roots of boxing, to teach young, sweet men how to be tough warriors. I photographed ceremonial burials in Sumba, where the textiles and the carvings were amazing. And every year I would go back with suitcases filled with photographs to give away to the villages I had visited the year before. After 5 or 6 years like that, people were sending runners out or contacting me to tell me there was going to be a wild ceremony. I needed to come. So the world started opening up for me in an amazing way. This was in the Spice Islands in the Maluku, and there the animist culture had recently been outlawed by Anabaptists. And so people had to go in hiding, wearing their ritual clothing to talk to their ancestors, and they would bring me with them. This is a dongson drum from the 10th century BC. Also, I photographed things like jousting in Sumba, where blood had to be spilled so the ground would be fertile. Hunting in Flores and burial houses in Sulawesi. This was what I did. And throughout all these places, the one theme that ran through all of them was the idea of animism, that everything is alive. And that was the answer I think I really needed from when I was a kid. That whole insular idea of living for tomorrow, you know, which you didn't even think about what was in front of you in the moment. Here, everything was alive and needed to be shown respect. In Bali, I've been a very lucky guy. So the idea of predicting the past was, how could I have ever predicted that I would be standing in front of you tonight talking about these experiences? But when I was in Bali, I had this family that took me in as their surrogate son. This is my Balinese father, Ida Bagus Sutarja, who's no longer with us, and his wife, Ida Ayu. And Ida Bagus Sutarja had a father who was a very famous mask carver named Glodog. I mention this because Glodog's best friend was a guy who became the high priest of Bali, a guy named Ratu Padanda. We became very good friends. And people said he only spoke High Balinese, no Indonesian. I had learned Indonesian in a kindergarten, sitting in little teeny chairs with kindergartners because it's not their first language. And so I could speak passable Indonesian, what's called pasar, market language. And you would never speak to a High Balinese in pasar. You never would. So we would wait for all of his attendants and acolytes to leave, and then he would begin telling me great stories about when he was a rakish child and the things he did that were kind of naughty. And in his Bali G'day, there was a photograph of him in the late 40s that I swear was done by Cartier-Bresson, who was in Bali at the time. It was a beautiful photograph, mostly eaten by insects, but you could still see the way it was set up. And Ratu Padanda was a strange guy. My brother David met him. It was a strange guy. He liked to tweak the noses of royalty, because they would all ask for the most important priest to oversee their ceremonies, rites of passage. And it could only be the Ratu Padanda who would be there. And so he would take his little white photographer with him, which would upset the kings and princes. And they didn't want a boule there. It was insulting to them. And he thought it was hilarious. So I got to photograph amazing things. Plus, Lauren had also introduced me to this small village in Tagus of farmers who were a spirited group. They had a dance school and an amazing gamelan. And they danced without masks, which was unusual for Bali. But they were so popular that people wanted them to open up temple ceremonies. Because when a temple loses its power, it's because it's too human. It needs to be wild. So a trance of some kind is a wild thing. And so by bringing it into the temple, you could revitalize what was a dying place. And so we would travel in sand trucks from village to village with this gamelan. It was amazing. I photographed first menstruation ceremonies and trance with, Rangda. And at that time, this is now 6 years into my tenure photographing in Bali, which Drexel was very nice to give me long leaves to do. An elderly Englishman, he was probably younger than I am now, walked into my little Balinese rice barn hut and said, "Excuse me, do you know where Stuart Rome lives?" "I'm sorry, Derek." But I said, "Who's asking?" And he said, "David Lewiston." And that name is really familiar. And it turns out he was the guy who recorded the Balinese gamelan None Such Traveler series, which were my very favorite recordings that I escaped from my suburban house listening to in Connecticut when I was in high school. So we began working together. He made recordings of trance, and I made photographs of trance. These are a couple of pictures from the farmers from Tagus dance troupe, in which these two dancers would go into trance at one point, and they played the parts of Sugriwa and Subali. And trance really is the origins of theater, where people really became the characters. So if you've ever been to a play and that happens, it's kind of amazing. It's a rare event. But here it happened on a daily basis. And this is one of the two monkey kings who jumped off the shoulders of these men they were nimbly fighting on, went to the fire that was illuminating the dance, put his hand in hot coals and washed his face with burning coals so he could have this terrifying mask. But sometimes ceremonies were stranger even than that. So, in this case, this man became a monkey, a wild animal, and he had to be tethered because the year before he had escaped into the forest and it took days to find him. But he was tethered so I could climb after him up this tree and photograph with one hand. Sometimes people became rocks or water. The idea of adat, which runs through manners, court culture, rituals, is this idea of animism where every mountain is an element of a language of the spirit, every object a symbol of other possibilities, where a temple becomes a mountain, a cave, a womb, a calabash of water, a reflection of the sea, and the sea is a memory of the Great Mother. It's an incredible equivalent, like the equivalent in a photograph. And so this idea of photographing things that were what they were and they were transformed into something else, they spoke to, things like Ovid's Metamorphosis. What did he say? My spirit compels me to sing of things changing their forms. This is all what this was for me. It was the trance, which was communicating with nature, and nature communicating back. This is the 10th century spring. Someone saw in this pada stone what looked like imagery. And in that imagery got revealed by the talented sculptor who sculpted out the figures that he saw there. One day, it was the middle of winter. It was a year I lived in Indonesia for a full year, and I was a little homesick. And I used to go to a 10th century Buddhist site just to sit and collect myself. A very old man walked up to me and said, we spoke for a little bit, and he said, "Why do you always come here? I see you here every year." And I said, the reasons why. I'm lonely. This place is very comforting for me. It's a very beautiful and powerful place. And he said, "Today I have a gift for you." So he held my hand and we walked across this river, which I would never have gone across on my own because it's filled with cobras and some of the spots are very deep. And I carry a fairly large camera, or in this case a 2¼ camera, that was valuable to me. And we walked across and it was a mud bank, nothing remarkable, and he starts digging away the mud. And there's this full-length figure, he reveals just the head. We covered it up again because there's a lot of these things that are stolen. But every day seemed like a major discovery there. And I began to have this idea of what it would be like to photograph the landscape as if it had a presence, as if the landscape was speaking back in that trance communication. It was a conceit of sorts, but it was also because I had been reading the first Jackson Pollock biography at the time. I had, the year before, seen at the Drawing Center in New York a show of Agnes Martin and Hilma af Klint, and I was thinking, what are the roots of that? What are the inspirations for work like that? And I began to feel that they were something like this. In fact, when someone had said to Jackson Pollock, "Why doesn't he work from nature?" he said, "I am nature." When somebody asked Walt Whitman why he was contradictory, or would say one thing one day and something the other day, he would say, "I am multitudes." So, in it, there is a link in some artist's life where they make the bridge to the world outside of their ego and their personality. And I began to think, what would that bridge look like? So this was the very first photograph that I felt was successful in this regard. This was made in Bali at the end of my tenure there before moving back to Philadelphia, where I was reunited with my wife, with my girlfriend, Catherine, who became my wife. And I wanted to figure out how to make pictures without traveling long distances anymore. And at first, I started making pictures that were very romantic. The idea of the sublime was very important to me. Something that was beautiful and potentially frightening at the same time. This was the beginnings of the work in Asia and the United States. But I also wanted to thank today some of the people that have made my thinking possible as well. This is the work of Bruce Pollock, and of course it's Bruce and his wife Juna. And his pattern work really resonated with me from the very beginnings for reasons I couldn't quite understand. But after my travels in Indonesia, I understood quite well why they were so powerful and why they resonated so much. I had photographed actually a star map that looked very much like one of Bruce's drawings. They're powerful things, and they kind of suggested to me the possibility that I could remove the veneer of romanticism from my images and work in this way where one foot was in the real world and one foot was in the world of the abstract. I also was thinking that objects like Bruce's are almost like technological objects that could be used for contemplation. I thought, what would it be like if you could make images that were contemplative and could be looked at for years? Because the problem for me as a young photographer was you'd go to a gallery in New York, you'd watch people walk by the photographs very quickly. I wanted a picture you could live with for years and it would change. It would morph in a way. And so these were the pictures that ended up becoming my book, Forest, which was published in 2005. Around the 1990s, there was an amazing show at the Penn Museum of the Richard Rosenblum collection of Chinese scholar stones, which was a watershed moment for me as well, where objects had zoomorphic and anthropomorphic qualities. I thought, wow. And these great Chinese scholars from the 6th, 7th, and 8th century would collect an object like this and put it in a beautiful stand that they would create, and it would become, through history, more and more and more important. But more important than its importance and its value was the fact that they saw these things in inanimate objects. It was this idea of animism as well. And I couldn't afford scholar's stones, so I made pictures that had in them imagery that were unexpected, like in this picture, or this is my scholar's stone, which was a photograph. When the Forest book was published, it got some good reviews, and it brought me to the attention of the new director of the Southeast Museum of Photography in Florida. They were just finishing building a brand new museum, and they wanted to show a succession of shows describing the kinds of work that they were going to show in the future, one of which was landscape, and they chose me for some reason. So I thought, instead of making forest photographs again, I'm going to work with this idea of pattern, but I'm also going to reinvestigate some of the other tropes that I worked with earlier in my career. So I had this tripartite idea for a show called Signs and Wonders. And one part of it was this part, drawn from nature. So there were two parts to this section. One was photographs of patterns found in ancient limestone records, fossil records. This was actually at the southern tip of Florida, a really unusual piece of landscape, because it originally was found at the southern tip of Africa when Gondwanaland split and part of it joined up at that very tip near the Everglades. This was it. So it was a very, very ancient seabed. And in it, if you looked carefully and with a trick of light, which is what photography is often about, you could see inside of it iconic imagery. And to me, that was fascinating. And I paired them with ephemeral images of animal tracks. This is a turtle track, which looked to me like a Nazca Plains photograph without, any relative scale visible. But sometimes they were, something very simple, drawn by insects like this anthill. And the other section was the signs section. And in that section, I got to revisit some of the ideas I played with in modern mythologies 20 years before. In this, though, I got to talk about our uneasy relationship to the natural world, and also about our wretched experience and how we treated First Nations people. This was a thing I discovered at a tourist trap in St. Augustine, Florida. And it was a coincidence. I thought it was a restroom. I walked in there to take a pee, and I opened the door, and I nearly had a heart attack. There was, in the foreground, what had been 2 years before, a vitrine of Native American bones that had been repatriated recently. And so they photographed the vitrine and put it back there. And inside, on the background, is this FSA-style painting of this horrendous scene of how white people assumed Native Americans lived, like cannibals. So that was the sign section. And I also played with this idea of photographic sentences, paragraphs, etc. For the book. It gave me a lot of license to experiment. And of course, then the final section was the wonders section, which were related to the forest photographs. But a strong element of narrative still runs through my work. I always work on more than one project at a time. Most artists generally do, or most photographers do anyways. And so there is abstraction and figuration. And the big pole of figuration in my town was my friend Don Colley, an amazing painter, an amazing artist who now lives in Chicago. Like Bruce, almost like family to me. And so, I chronicled my family through the life of my daughter Sarah, who's here tonight, through the different stages of her life. And I still do whenever she gives me the opportunity. Also, while I was working on the newest photographs, which is the last section, and then I'll let you go, I was home-based in Mendocino while I was working in Northern California, and it's the center of pot growing culture. And I started working on this project well before marijuana was as legal as it is now. And so I made a lot of friends in Mendocino. Many of them had businesses doing pot grows indoors and outdoors. And we had this idea of photographing these kind of political cartoons of people as farm animals inside their grows. And we did these under Sam Silverfish's name again. He pops up again. Because Sam Silverfish could photograph these. I could make the prints, quantities of them. They could be signed by anybody, because nobody was Sam Silverfish. And the proceeds went to funding the kids who were living on the street that came once a year to pick pot. Many of them came from damaged homes. And this allowed them to get psychological counseling. And if they didn't want that, they could at least get clean clothes and food. And to this day, there are postcards being sold. That money goes to that. This is Pebbles Trippett, who's one of the most famous political pot growers in Northern California. She was terrific to work with. So there were a lot. I got a million of them. The other thing, though, is, once again, this is an opportunity to thank a good friend of mine who's been instrumental in my thinking over the years and also has been a really great supporter and a terrific friend. This is Allison Rossiter, who's here tonight. And her work using abstraction in the most elegant way, but rooted in conceptual ideas that run very deep. This particular project is about time and the history of photography. It's well worth looking into. Her work is phenomenal. But it did inspire me in a way to look at the thing I'm about to show you in some kind of a different manner. And that's this series, Oculus. Now, to make the pictures I'm about to show you, these trees are very rare. They're 3,000 to 5,000 year old, often sequoias and redwoods. They're giant trees. There are very few of them left because we destroyed most of them for lumber. And they were money instead of the spiritual element than they really were. In fact, the Yurok tribe, which is a very large tribe in Northern California, were for millennia caretakers of these trees. And the only work they could get, the men could get for the last 200 years, was cutting them down. These trees are their ancestors. When an elder was dying, they were placed inside these hollow cores so that their spirit could be raised up. You know, it's an amazing thing about these spaces to me. They were incredibly powerful. They're cave-like. They're passages to an underworld, and also a place to make contact with the powers and forces which will eventually make their way to light. What an amazing place to be inside of. And each one of them had incredible imagery as well. I've been working, the last 2 years I worked on this project out there. I've been working with tribal elders to get their stories and hopefully their support, in the hopes that when this book eventually happens, maybe there'll be Yurok stories as well. And then, you know, my wife asked me not to continually mention all the people I wanted to thank, because she said it'll sound like name dropping. Because I have so many wonderful friends who are architects and archaeologists and amazing painters and musicians and rock musicians and composers, some of which you'd recognize, and I promised her I wouldn't do that. But I couldn't finish tonight without mentioning my three musketeers. Paul Cava, whose gallery in town was incredibly instrumental to my education, and his own photographs are an inspiration to me as well. My friend Stephen Ray, whose book projects I've been very privileged to work on over the years as just an image retoucher. These are his projects. And my photo brother, who I met the same time I met Allison, was Gray Crawford, who's my photo brother. And so I had to mention them because their work and their friendship has meant an enormous amount to me over the years. And of course, my family, who's held me in a loving embrace all these years as well. And before I end tonight, I just also wanted to point out that as I was mentored by so many amazing people throughout my career, I'm hoping that maybe a small amount of what I offered here was of value, like your passport to my students, for what you're going to encounter or have already. So I'm just going to show you a few of my photography students who have gone through this program. Erin Patrice O'Brien, who was an early grad from Drexel University during my tenure here. This is Erin, and she actually came from New York. She makes amazing photographs. Amanda Tinker, who's an amazing photographer and a terrific teacher I have the privilege of working alongside of. Mike Froyo, who saved this slide presentation from failing because the images looked like crap 2 days ago. Doug Wolf, an entrepreneur, original owner, one of the members of the La Colombe family, and a terrific photographer. Jeff Stockbridge, who's also here tonight, whose compassionate photographs of people who are in need of immense compassion has garnered him a lot of attention, and recently a Guggenheim. And Sarah Stolfa, whose work done in my junior projects class won the New York Times Award against graduates from photo programs. She got a graduate school free ride to Yale University. And now she's one of the linchpins in the photographic community by running a remarkable organization called the Philadelphia Photo Art Center. So with that, did I go past 45 minutes? With that, I thank you all, and I hope that you all get to join me in a drink.